Alright, so the next two I wanted to go into were these two, The Mask of Zorro and A Knight's Tale, and one reason I could be putting these together is they're about, a guy that comes from the sort of slums of the areas, and then he takes on a different identity, and it's like sort of a higher identity, and becomes this sort of hero to the land, and then he's also got it's about nobility and honor, and he's got to get the girl away from a bad guy, and all that stuff. But honestly, the main reason I wanted to put these together is they both just kind of represent a kind of movie that I miss at this point, where it was more about, real sets and real stunts and, adventure and fun and stuff like that. Right before things kind of got it was kind of the norm at the time for the most part, I feel like. And then we were kind of starting to get into more CGI heavy stuff and stuff trying to be darker and more serious about itself. And obviously these are pretty much for pure entertainment value, but like I said, having those real qualities to them also, like hundreds of extras and like big wide shots of real sets and real people and real stunts and all that. And it just feels like it's an era that only pops in every now and then now. And so to kind of get back to that, what's also really funny is, especially choosing these two for this, is that I guess I kind of took this for granted before we went down that path of everything feeling a bit faker and not as fun, because I didn't really appreciate either one of these when I first saw them. Especially, I remember vividly in 2001 when A Knight's Tale was really popular, where when it came out and people were talking about it, and then when it got on like the movie channels, like everybody was watching it and everybody was talking about it. Obviously Heath Ledger was supposed to be like the next big thing, and obviously completely exceeded expectations on that. And I think I still struggle a little bit with medieval movies. So it's still a movie that I'm not like fully in love with, but it's definitely a movie I go back to when I sort of crave that sort of old-fashioned feeling that once was in this era, where you would think old-fashioned would be older than, the late 90s and the early 2000s, which is what these two are. Like I said, it's almost like we were approaching the end of a sort of era with these two. And going back to it, like I said, it takes you back to a good... I don't want to just say, oh, since they don't make movies like this now a lot, that movies are just shit now. That's not what I'm saying at all, but it takes me to a place of comfort when I come back to these two. And like I said, just a place that I kind of miss as far as movies and the way that they used to be made regularly. And like what was the norm at the time. So, talking about... both movies do open with something that I don't miss, which is any time a movie opened with a paragraph of text. And it was usually some sort of, set way back in time movie. And it's like I felt immediately put off by a movie anytime the big wall of text came up to give us history, because it's like, all you're focused on is reading it really fast before it disappears, which means you're not taking any of it in, but you can still get context clues of what's going on in the story anyway, and the movie will tell you anyway, so what is the point of the big wall of text? There isn't really one. So, that was always something that was kind of off-putting to me, but the thing about it is, when you talk about the opening and that being off-putting, and it's like, oh, this is going to be boring, right? Well, not only does The Mask of Zorro have this sort of whole dynamite opening, but it's an opening that's nearly 20 minutes long, where we set up Zorro as, when Anthony Hawkins' character is him, and he's set up as this superhero of sorts, and you can get the sense of, like, when you see he wears the mask, he goes out and does his thing, and then he has a secret identity that he goes back to. He even has like a little sort of cave that he goes into and then becomes his normal self. And you can see where there was like superhero inspiration from Zorro. Like the idea of Zorro, the Mark of Zorro being the movie that the Waynes saw the night they were shot. The night that, Bruce Wayne essentially became Batman as a child. I feel like it's not a coincidence that it was a Zorro movie that they were going to see, as far as, like, the lore goes. And so, when you see that, and then you see this gripping setup where we have... where he is... this hero that we set up that seems larger than life, loses everything in, like, just a couple of moments. When we introduce our villain, Montero and how he not only does the wife get killed, but there's also him taking the baby and imprisoning Hopkins, and it's this whole. It feels like we've learned such a tragic story at the start of it. We just met this character. Like I said, we saw him as a larger than life character when he entered the movie, and now just to watch him stripped of everything, it feels like a whole just a short 20-minute movie that's just a full on tragedy, and we feel every bit of it right at the very start. And the way they handle that and set it up sets up these surprisingly emotional stakes that are going to be involved throughout this movie, despite the fact that it never loses the action and fun way about itself. And I really like the way it's able to set that and kind of put that underlying emotion in it, and we feel it pretty much right away. But like I said, when you see the wall of text, it can be off-putting at first, and you're not sure what you're going to get into, and you feel like it might be a bore. So, A Knight's Tale was a really interesting experience, and it was one that I kind of knew about going in, but I was still kind of in disbelief because in 2001, a movie like A Knight's Tale kind of comes from out of nowhere, as far as I remember. What I do remember is my fifth grade teacher had seen it, and we would talk about movies a lot, and like in between class. And she was telling me about A Knight's Tale, which I had seen commercials for and TV spots for, and she was telling me about them clapping and "We Will Rock You" being the opening scene. And I remember thinking like, well, that can't be right. I've seen TV spots for that movie. There's no way that's the movie she's talking about. There must be some confusion here. And so when I saw it and the whole anachronistic vibe is there throughout the movie, it's like, oh, this is just something else entirely. And that's something that I feel like I kind of took for granted at the time, because like I said, I just really have never been into medieval set movies. But even when something this different and out of nowhere came along that they did with the genre, I don't know why that. It's weird to me in retrospect that didn't really sink in. Like, this is wild. like the idea of Brian Helgeland coming up with this, and taking this genre that we know and putting this really seemingly random spin on it, and yet somehow it feels like the classic rock amidst the medieval setting. It's weird how much it works. It feels like a swing for the fences that probably shouldn't have worked at all, and somehow it does. And I honestly still can't really do the math and put the pieces together as to how that works. And the idea that it's not even necessarily just classic rock. There's also the training montage set to Lowrider seems so random, but somehow it works. The dance scene to Golden Years, all of it, and like all the song choices, and the fact that it's throughout. It's not just like random every now and then. It's a choice that the entire movie makes, and it gives it this life. And I think it's the idea also of how the movie happens very, very quickly. Where I talked about, it takes 20 minutes for the Mask of Zorro to open, and it's a fantastic 20 minutes, and I wouldn't change that at all. But it's so interesting to see the contrast in A Knight's Tale, where he takes on his new identity before we even get the opening credits, and it happens that quickly. I will say it does feel like A Knight's Tale may open too much with a bang, and that kind of makes problems for the pacing later as it goes on, because the Mask of Zorro is like 2 hours and 17 minutes, and A Knight's Tale is like 5 minutes shorter at 2:12. To me, A Knight's Tale feels a lot longer, and I do wonder if starting right away almost kind of shot itself in the foot a little bit. But we'll get more into that as we go on. But to talk about, I guess we'll talk about the love story angle, because that becomes a big portion of both movies, especially A Knight's Tale. The thing about Catherine Zeta-Jones's character in The Mask of Zorro, this could have been one of those cases where she's just a love interest, or she's just a damsel in distress, because she's the one sort of caught in the middle. But the interesting thing about this character, when you think about the opening and then how like 20 years have happened in between, and now she's an adult, because she was a baby at the time everything went down. So as far as she knows, Montero's her dad, and that's it. And then her mother died giving birth to her. So watching this character, who could have just been some, whatever love interest or whatever damsel in distress, we get to watch her learn gradually over the course of the movie through various clues. They really stretch it out well and really make it this big character arc for her. she's basically learning gradually that her entire life has been a lie. And that brings such an interesting dynamic to the character once she's interacting with Hopkins, and we know what we know, but she doesn't. But there's just enough sense that she feels a connection to him, and then there's the fact that we have Antonio Banderas leading the movie, who honestly, it's hard to think of other people that have as much charisma and presence and likability and just how he can do the action, how believable Antonio Banderas can be, and how charismatic he can be in pretty much any kind of role. And it does feel like this is the kind of role that he was made for, because one of the story points that's continuous throughout stuff like this, where it's like a continuous character. I always feel like there's a lot of clumsiness when it comes to passing of the torch stories, and it's always especially like nowadays where they bring in like old franchises and bring in a new person, and it's like it's so clear that it's just like we want to sell this franchise thing, and it never really feels like, oh, this is somebody I could see leading the franchise now and taking on the character. It's a very hard thing to pull off, and to basically make the movie about that, like to start it with an aged Zorro who's been just stripped of everything, and then to bring in somebody like Antonio Banderas. Antonio Banderas is somebody where it's like, I could imagine him as an original Zorro. Like, if Antonio Banderas could go back in time and be the first person that ever played Zorro, that would absolutely seem right. Like, seem what it was supposed to be. And the way he brings that energy and the humor he can bring to any movie or any role also really plays a big part in this also, where when we see him as like this bumbling character at first, and then he becomes the noble hero, all of it works. Like, all of it rings true, whether when he's the Zorro that doesn't know anything and is very far away from being Zorro, to by the time he's like full Zorro at the end and he's in the full getup. It feels like this perfect transition throughout the movie. And then, of course, the importance is going to be the chemistry between him and Catherine Zeta-Jones to come full circle. Um, and yeah, we all know, like I said, we all know the scene where they have the sword fight, the flirtatious sword fight, and he's like, cutting her clothes off and stuff like that. And there's the scene where they dance, there's the scene in the confession booth, and it's like all of these scenes are kind of on fire. Like, it never really feels like, oh, this is the love interest scene. Now, I think it's because she's such a well-rounded character and is going through such her own arc and such her own experience throughout the story and this whole emotional journey. And some of those smaller scenes also, like the scenes she has with Hawkins especially, where she's talking about her mom, and she's told a lot that she looks like her mom, and the way she says stuff like she likes being told that kind of thing because it's a way of like getting to know her mom without ever having known her mom, is by just looking like her and being reminding people of her. And there's something really beautiful going on with this character on an emotional standpoint, and that's going to bring a lot of this. And like, once again, the connection to the villain also, where this is the person that took everything from Hopkins, and including her, and she's completely under the impression that this has always been her life, is this guy. And so the idea of pulling her away from that and getting her away from that has much more of an emotional appeal than just a story point and wanting the hero to get the girl and stuff like that. It goes like way beyond that, and I really love that. As far as the love story in A Knight's Tale, well, first of all, obviously, we were talking about how Heath Ledger was like really breaking out at this point. Like, there was 10 Things I Hate About You, and there was this, and it was like, I remember at the time I was at that age where I was like a young teenager, so it was like, oh god, I wasn't even a teenager yet, I was about to be. And so, any like young actor that comes along that's seen as like a heartthrob and stuff like that, you just think, oh, that guy sucks or something. Like the way people would, like the way like people that age went after DiCaprio when Titanic came out, because all the girls flocked to him, all the guys were like, oh, he's a pretty boy or whatever. And it's and that's I feel like that's what Ledger was kind of at the time before he really broke out and showed how much of a deep dramatic actor he would be. When you go back to it now, especially knowing his legacy now, adds a whole other context to what's going on here, where you can see a depth to him and you can see a presence and you can see how he hooked people from the very start. Even in movies like this that are certainly not like, big dramatic pieces. Like this isn't, Brokeback or The Dark Knight or anything like that. But yet he was already making himself known in that way in movies like this. And he was able to bring, like I said, a depth to a movie that's set in medieval times that has a rock soundtrack. It's like, this is kind of a hard thing to bring depth to. It's an awesome concept, but as far as bringing like the depth to it like that, you've got a lot to go over. It's a pretty uphill climb to get over that and show like a real sort of dramatic edge to a character that's more or less pretty comedic also. It's the way he's able to combine those, where there's, an emotional foundation, but he's also got a bit of action hero vibes in the jousting moments, and he's got, the noble sort of hero vibe to him. And then, yeah, and throwing in the comedic stuff that this movie asked for, because this movie is, like, I mean, it's a medieval set movie about jousting and becoming a hero and stuff like that, and it's a love story. It's also practically a comedy. Like, it doesn't have comedy relief in it. It's basically that's one of the main genres of the movie, is comedy. And I think that's also adds a lot to the appeal, where it doesn't just feel like an overabundance of comedy relief. It just embraces comedy altogether as a genre. And so to have all those dimensions to this performance is, like I said, just really was showing ahead that, and I don't know how many people knew at the time, like, what he was capable of exactly, but people knew he was magnetic, it seemed. So, take that into account. Poor Shannon Sossamon playing Jocelyn. She's fine, like, as far as her performance and their chemistry and stuff like that. And the way they play into that romance also, where it's like this young romance, so when he comes into town on his horse and sees her, it's like a teen movie score kind of starts to take over a little bit. And then they have their little romance, and he has to win her over and all that, and it's nice. Now, it doesn't have the power by any means of what Antonio Banderas and Catherine Zeta-Jones have. That's a really high bar anyway, but here's the problem is, everything I just said about Heath Ledger, you would say, oh, but it should be effortless. And for him, I feel like it was. The problem with Shannon Sossamon is, it's not a problem with her, like, specifically herself, but having to match what Ledger is bringing in his presence, there's a bit of unevenness here, as far as it doesn't feel like they explode off the screen like Banderas and Zeta-Jones do. Ledger explodes off the screen, and Sossamon's just kind of by his side, it feels like. So that presents a problem, because there's a whole portion of A Knight's Tale where the love story just kind of takes over for like a long time. For like the whole middle of the movie, it almost even abandons the jousting and just focuses on the love story. And when the presence between the two of them can't really be matched, and it doesn't feel like this is a combined sort of, moment in the movie, that's, it presents a problem. But when when we have moments where they're separate, like when they work together to write her the ultimate love letter, and we see them at a distance where they're dictating and she's reading it, there is something here when they're not on screen together. And it's like, I feel like it's even telling that the first time they share a kiss, it's through Alan Tudyk in this very funny moment. So, like I said, I feel like that's kind of telling of the chemistry between them, where the chemistry's there, but like, there's just an unevenness here, where it's not near as present and effective as what's going on in The Mask of Zorro as far as the love story goes. And then, because we also get to that whole moment where she's asked him to lose on purpose to prove his love. And so, with that, where we've been following the jousting story, and we know what their plan is and what their journey has been up to this point, instead of the love story enhancing the movie when it gets to this point, it feels like it's just stopping the movie completely. And that's where I'm talking about, where it's like the love story takes over. So you could say, oh no, this is just part of the story. This is part of how they sort of fall in love with each other, where he proves his love to her. But like I said, when you've already established the movie for nearly an hour, you really get the sense that the brakes just slam on it, like right in the middle. And like I was saying before about how it probably affects the pacing that the movie started so quickly. Like the movie starts immediately, and it starts with knowing what their mission is and seeing him train and do all that. That's something else that both movies do really great is like old fashioned training montages. Um, and that part of William's training is like he has one set of training for the jousting and then a whole other set of training for the dancing, which is really great montage also. But yeah, when it just sort of stops dead here, that's where it kind of loses me a little bit for a while, and I think it also doesn't help. Where we were talking about the very close relationship that Catherine Zeta-Jones has with Montero, and how this is a person she believes is her father and has her whole life. So there's definitely going to be a massive conflict here, a massive emotional conflict, getting her to the other side. Our villain in A Knight's Tale is Rufus Sewell, and I love Rufus Sewell just in general, and especially when he's playing like sinister characters. It's something he does really well. But the thing here is, when he starts off, he's like, just a pompous douche that you'd expect. Like, he's the guy that, wants your girlfriend, but he's also, like, especially in his eyes, it's like there's something really sinister. And the way he can portray that is done really well for this purpose. And then he becomes a sporting rival. And so there's multiple aspects to that also, but... And he's the kind of douche that says mercy is a weakness and shit like that. So he's a fun villain, but he also feels relatively minor for the most part, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he just fucking disappears for the whole middle of the movie. And he's built up to, because they're waiting, to duel him, and he's just like not appearing. And so but the fact that he's already been established at that point and then just disappears, by the time he eventually comes back, there's not really much of an impact. And they double down when he does come back to try to make him as much of a villain as possible. Like, there's the whole thing where he, tracks him down and finds his dad and finds out his real identity and stuff like that. And by then, he doesn't feel like a formidable enemy. He just feels like a pain in the ass. And the movie feels like it's definitely trying to play him up a lot more than that. Where, like, it's the moment when they have William captured and he's, like, monologuing to him. It's like it's supposed to be this sort of Maximus and Commodus moment, like the moment right before the final battle in Gladiator. But it's just like, this guy's just a douche. And and Rufus Sewell, of all people, you would think would be able to... I mean, he does bring as much as he can to it, but you would think there would be more to this. It wouldn't feel as hollow when this character is supposed to feel like almost pure evil by the time we get to the end, and the big moment. And we get to the moment where he's basically actually trying to kill him during the joust, and how the joust actually does become a life or death situation by the end of it, once he loses his armor and everything. And I don't know, he's just always been a really weak villain. To me anyway, and it's also funny that Rufus Sewell actually plays the villain in the sequel to The Mask of Zorro, which we won't talk about because it's a piece of shit that more or less betrays the characters, but so yeah, there's definitely a lot more strengths as far as all of this goes in The Mask of Zorro, but I don't want to sound like I'm trashing A Knight's Tale too much, because A Knight's Tale is one of those movies where I feel like I can see a whole bunch of flaws in it, and I could see, like, why, this could work better, like, maybe they cut this down, or maybe they made this character more, in-depth or something. But A Knight's Tale just carries a likability with it that's really hard to get through. As far as wanting to find, faults in it, if you want to do that for some reason, it's really hard to do that, because the likability takes it a long way, and the way it just embraces its fun nature and its comedy takes it a long way, and it's something that you don't really want to take too seriously anyway. And usually I feel like that's kind of a cop-out, but the movie sets itself up enough as this sort of fantasy. And like I said, adding the anachronistic music to it just does that even more. And the fact that Tale is in the title, like, that's the whole thing. I don't want to sound like I'm hating on it and being too pedantic towards it, because when I was talking about the idea of the production values of it and the fun nature of it and the adventure aspect of it, is where the appeal of both of these movies are. Even if The Mask of Zorro was able to do it with more depth, because I mean, when you just kind of take a look at these movies, where with The Mask of Zorro, like I was talking about I felt like I took action adventure movies for granted when I was younger, when the movies were more real, and it's like you look at this and you have like actual stunts and people jumping around. There's the moment where he's pulled up by the rope and then he swings on the chandelier. There's like things that actually break and actual destruction that's happening, like real explosions. The sword fighting, and the sword fighting is done in like wide shots so you can see people actually doing it. There's actual choreography. There's tons and tons of extras, real people in the background. There's gigantic sets. The same thing for A Knight's Tale. There's just look at all the actual, real, living, breathing people in the background, and it's amazing. There's the moment when Jocelyn's trying to get William to talk the way that he does in his letter, and I love the way this is just like a big wide shot that's like one long cut for a while. And it's like the set is basically the star of this moment, and it shows how small they are in it. And you see real people in the background walking by or reacting to this or kind of eavesdropping. And like I said, just everything feels so big and real. And it's like you watch these movies back, and it's just like so much of this is missing now. And while Mask of Zorro may be more, action heavy, there is the jousting in A Knight's Tale, which Helgeland did a great job of making really cinematic. Because jousting may not be... It's one of those things that's exciting in like very brief bursts. And a character even brings... It's like either Jocelyn or Bernice Bejo brings up that that jousting is too abrupt. So it's not very entertaining. But Helgeland makes it very cinematic. But what A Knight's Tale lacks in action that The Mask of Zorro has, it makes up for with this great supporting ensemble, where we have Mark Addy and Alan Tudyk just sort of playing off each other. Those are two guys that were basically made to be the supporting characters that can play off another supporting character, and you just get the sense of what camaraderie must have been on this set. Like how amazing this group of people together must have been working together, and the chemistry between all of them is just really... that comes through significantly more than the chemistry between William and Jocelyn. And really kind of picks up that slack, and keeps the movie from falling short. But if you want to talk supporting players, a couple more people like Laura Fraser is here, Lydia herself, and the idea of her being like a platonic member of the group, like she's not the love interest in any particular person in the group. She's just one of them, is an angle that I really love, and I really love her addition to the group and the way that goes on. And like I said, Berenice Bejo, who was in, who 10 years later would finally get sort of mainstream attention for The Artist. And she doesn't have a lot to do, but she has like little moments here and there. One that always stood out to me was when Prince Edward is revealed, and it's James Purefoy, and she has this very nonchalant reaction to it. Like her eyebrows just kind of go up for a second, and it's like one cut to her. And just her reaction to this big reveal is something that always stood out to me that's great. But obviously, if we're going to talk about any supporting performance in A Knight's Tale, it would be Paul Bettany, obviously. Where Paul Bettany feels almost like the second star of the movie. Where like he almost gives even Heath Ledger a run for his money, as far he really threatens to just steal the movie away from him. And it's like that's that case where you can imagine any actor would salivate at the chance to play a part like this, where not only does he have to do the fast talking and sort of dealing thing, but these big moments where he's, the announcer for William. And you just get the sense that this is an actor just basking in every single moment of screen time that he has. There's there's that moment that I think the legend is that he does the whole presentation, and then the crowd doesn't react, and then Mark Addy just screams, yeah, and then everybody reacts. I think the legend is that the audience, didn't understand him,
and so they didn't know it was time to react. So Mark Addy just kind of ad-libbed a scream to make them react. I hope that's true, but yeah, seeing the way Bettany handles this, there's that moment when he has another big presentation scene, and then at the end of it he says, "God, I'm good," and it's like I feel like that line is just as much Bettany coming out as it is Jeff saying it, and and just there's little comedic moments also where it's where he's like shining the light on his the competitor sort of hype men. And then there's he has just some great lines here also, and I love the fact that it's clear his character is a writer and the way that they really put that into his dialogue also. I think one of my favorite lines in the movie, which may honestly be one of my favorite lines ever, is when he's talking to the guy and they say like, how will you ever take us on or something, and he says, "I will eviscerate you in fiction." And it's like this. I love this character so much. It's definitely. I remember when Paul Bettany kind of started to break out more, like somewhere in between this and Marvel, he was kind of slowly building his reputation. And I remember pretty much any time Paul Bettany came up, it always came back to this, and everybody was like, "Oh yeah, he's good in this," and "Oh yeah, I see that he's doing bigger things." But him in A Knight's Tale is just another level. That's absolutely true. This is another one where it's like it feels like just as much a star in the making as Heath Ledger. And even though Bettany is still just sort of like playing supporting parts and supporting characters, and that's a real strength of his. Where obviously Ledger was could be the face of a movie easily. I feel like this is Bettany's sweet spot, and I think he's probably aware. He seems especially aware of that, playing a part like this and how he plays the part. So that's obviously really one of the big aspects of the movie. And talking about how the movie is practically a comedy and how we have so many comedic characters, I remember being really sort of I think I was confused the first time I saw The Mask of Zorro and how much comedy was in it, because I feel like it was sort of starting to become a thing that blockbuster movies like this had as much comedy in it as this does. Because it's always been a thing that big movies or whatever have comedy relief moments or comedy breaks or something like that. But like I said, there's a whole comedic angle to this, a portion of this movie where he's going from you know the bumbling guy from the slums to Zorro. And so in between, he is going to stumble, and the way they use that for comedic purposes. And I feel like I was uptight about it for a long time, about putting comedy in big movies like this, where I was at a time where it was like, big action movies have to be big action movies, and that's basically it. And comedy seemed out of place to me or forced to me. Um, but as it goes on and you realize that comedy is basically part of the personality of blockbusters, and we could go into the whole Marvel argument about how they went overboard with that. But here it does feel like this sort of perfect amount where there is slapstick, which can be a low form of comedy, but when it's done, it can also seem very old fashioned and classic. And I think that's the vibe of why you put a lot of slapstick in a movie like this, is because the whole movie is sort of going for an old fashioned vibe in general, whether it be the action or the love story or the way the comedy is handled. So that makes sense. There's funny lines here and there, like when he has the sword and Hawkins asks him, "How do you know how to use that?" And he says, "Yeah, you just take the pointy end and put it in the other man," which is really funny. But like I said, the physical stuff here is really interesting. I remember being so flabbergasted by the moment. I think I even rewound it to make sure I saw it happen, because I was so surprised, and I was kind of put off at the time, but we'll say it was surprise. The scene where he leaps off the roof and misses the horse and hits the ground, which for starters is fantastic because it's all in one shot. So I really appreciate it now. But like I said, I remember being put off when I was younger because it was like, isn't this guy supposed to be like super cool? And it's like, I wasn't really taking in at the time, like, well, no, not right now, he's not cool. He's trying. Like, he's going to get to that point. We have to watch him stumble to get to that point. And to use, like, slapstick comedy to do that when you're making an old-fashioned type movie, it makes sense and it works. And like I said, I watched that scene now, and I kind of love that that was my initial reaction to it. Even though I was put off by it at the time, it's like, I love the idea of seeing that, and it was so
it was kind of so out of left field. Like, it was so not something I would have expected in a movie like this, that it just completely surprised me. And the way they use it, and it's still these slapstick moments are still surrounded by this great sort of fun action going on. And like I said, moments where he's swinging by the chandelier and flying on ropes and stuff like that. And it's all of it is great. And there's even comedic moments with Hopkins where, like, he walks up to the guard and he's coughing, and then he just stops and punches him in the face. And like I said, the blending of that is something that I much more appreciate now than I did at the time. And like I said, the blending of never losing face of the fact that you're a big fun action movie, and also being able to throw, this ridiculous comedy into it, and how it actually works for the character. But if you want to talk about more emotional stuff, there are two moments in both of these movies that involve reunions with long lost fathers. So we talked a lot about the father stuff in The Mask of Zorro. So, and we finally do get to that moment when he has his sword at Montero's neck, and he's trying to tell him, he's telling him to tell her what the truth is. And I love the way like I said, they put pieces of it throughout, where she ran into the woman in the streets that used to take care of her, and she got that little piece of information of what her father's name is. But she refuses to believe it. But when Montero drops that name, it's just this big moment of revelation, and it's such a satisfying moment for us, the audience, also, that the truth is finally coming to light, because it was looking really dire when he was, even with the sword at his neck, he was refusing to give up the truth. And so when that moment slips, just that one moment that was built up by that previous scene, it's this really satisfying. And then when it's, his death scene at the end and everything, this whole emotion's coming to light, and she's realizing who her father really was in this moment that she's losing him. It's this reversal of him losing her from the beginning, and now she's losing him, but with the truth being revealed and them knowing who the other are in this last moment is so emotionally impactful. And like the way the movie built up to it the whole time, and it was a whole arc in itself, is just this beautiful closing moment to that. And you want to talk about reuniting with fathers, like I said, The Mask of Zorro does it for the whole movie. The whole movie is building up to that moment. Now, the thing about it is, in A Knight's Tale, it's sort of sporadic, where he brings up his father once or twice and about the, changing your stars and stuff like that. And we get two flashback scenes. And you would think, is that enough? Is that enough for, especially when we're looking at The Mask of Zorro, which took a whole movie to do it. Are two scenes and a couple of lines going to be enough to make the father scene emotionally impactful? And let me tell you, if you're not moved, if you're not so incredibly moved by this scene where he reunites with his father, who is blind now, and slowly figures out that it's his son that he's talking to, and they embrace, and then they sit at the table and he catches him up, if that doesn't get to you, I don't know what to do with you. You're dead. You're just a blank corpse inside. There's no soul in there whatsoever if this doesn't get to you. And they did it with like a couple of lines and a couple of scenes of build up, and that's it. And it hits so incredibly well. That's another scene also where you can see especially the acting ability in Heath Ledger to really bring the emotion in that scene. But he and his father both coming to the conclusion that this is them reuniting is just perfect. And then when his father comes to the joust at the end, it's like I said, it's so sporadic, but when it's here, it just completely hits the mark that it's aiming for, and it's this great emotional payoff. Like I said, much more emotional of a payoff than anything they're doing with Rufus Sewell's character, or really him and Jocelyn, much to me anyway. So as far as that goes, what's great about A Knight's Tale is that it does more or less have a light way about it. And I was talking about how they try to build up Rufus Sewell as like a big bad, but it only goes so far. But I think that also just has to do with the general light nature of the movie that's really working for it, and really adds to that likability of the movie that's really taking it past the dry spots and the not so great spots. Mask of Zorro, while it does have those slapstick moments, and it is like a lot of light action also, Mask of Zorro goes to some pretty dark places too, where we have especially the moment where they really build up the vendetta that he has against Captain Love, And it's enough of a vendetta. We've already seen the moment where his brother kills himself to keep from, being taken and tortured and maybe killed in a worse way. And then Love just takes his head. And that's one thing. But to see that Love kept his head in a jar and puts it on the table, and Banderas has to act like that wasn't his brother, that he's doing this whole thing for. That's a really dark and powerful scene for a movie like this, and especially for his character and the way Banderas plays it. And like I said, the revenge angle of this movie overall, where it's completely like when you look at like a fun action movie, typically there's not a lot of reason for the action to be happening, and The Mask of Zorro is a movie that puts a lot of reason behind its action. While there is some stuff that's fun for the sake of it, this whole story, and the story with Captain Love especially, is really driving the entire second half of the movie's action. Like, especially when it comes down to them facing each other, or him facing Montero, whoever it is. The action in the second half especially is really emotion driven, and we can feel the hatred in him. And I love the way they make it such a character point to bring the Zorro costume back into it, where it's not just, oh, you've earned this. Like, it has a practical purpose when there's that great moment where he's asking Hopkins, like, how do I keep hiding my hate? Because if I don't hide my hate, they'll know who I am, and that'll be a weakness. And the way you hide it is that reveal of the Zorro mask, and it's like that's the purpose of the whole costume. Is just this perfect reveal and this perfect build up. And there's also moments in between that are like poignant in themselves, like the three-fingered guy, and the way he comes back, and the way Captain Love is almost like, you would think it'd be in this pompous villain way when he says, "That's the second time I've shot this guy midair," but he almost just seems like he's just like it just completely like warped his mind of like I kind of can't believe that happened. It's like the most human moment Captain Love has. Because then obviously later we get moments like during the final battle, and Captain Love says, what's the line? You've lasted longer than your brother would have. I'm surprised you lasted this long. Your brother would have killed himself by now. It's like, Jesus, this guy is cold blooded. And it makes that whole climax all the more satisfying. The thing I wanted to bring up about the three-fingered guy was when as he dies and he realizes who Alejandro is. I love the fact that there's no dialogue there. He like smiles and knows that it's him and doesn't say anything. He knows to not say anything right before he dies. And he also knows where he's gotten to at this point and probably what's about to go down. And I love that moment also. But talking about these satisfying moments, especially during this climax, where our villains obviously get their comeuppance, and there's maybe one of the most satisfying explosions in an action movie that it ends on. But despite all this action, despite all the fire and the sword fighting and all that, it never loses sight of its emotion. After this, we have the moment where Hawkins dies, and they have their final father-daughter moment. And then we have this beautiful ending where we come full circle to the opening scene, where he's telling the story to the baby, and now he's Zorro, and she's the wife, and... But it's her, and like we're seeing her, and she was once in the position that the baby's in, and there's this whole full circle beautiful moment that it comes to, and it's a really beautiful closer after a really awesome fucking climax. And like I said, the emotional factor as far as romance goes may not be there in A Knight's Tale, and the seeing Rufus Sewell get taken down is satisfying, especially when they make the joust a life or death moment. Maybe not near as satisfying as Captain Love getting crushed by the gold and Montero being pulled down with it, followed by that massive explosion. But I guess at this point, it does feel like that they're different movies, and how A Knight's Tale was much more focused on its entertainment value, which is fantastic because that's its real strength that it was focusing on. So that's great. But the way the Mask of Zorro was able to do that and add these emotional layers to it that really do hit and are really great sort of character arcs that go through the whole movie. That's why The Mask of Zorro is one I'm probably more likely to come back to, and one that I just like better overall. Like I said, both of them just represent the kind of movie that I really miss, and would love to see I mean, they still make movies with like real extras and real backgrounds and stuff like that, but it feels like they're getting more and more rare. And those movies feel more special now when they come along, so that's kind of nice. But it does feel like we've just kind of come away from this sort of. I don't know if it's. You could say, oh, it's a nostalgia thing. It's just because it's the thing that we don't have is why we want it now. Because, like I said, I didn't really care for these at the time, and I had to like learn to love them because now they show what we don't have much in movies now. But I don't think that takes away from how I feel about these movies now and the power that I feel of how much I appreciate what's how these movies were made and how they, strive for entertainment value and fun and and don't have like cynicism and stuff like that. And it's yeah, so it feels like it's getting farther behind us, which is unfortunate. But the great thing is that these movies will always exist and we can always come back to them. So that's what we're going to do. So the next thing is going to be one more of those retrospective videos for September, and then another versus, and then a review video of new releases, and then it'll be October already. And all that stuff we've already got lined up. So hopefully that's fun. So until that, I think that's it.